It began as a tangled mass of roots, twisted, cracked, and packed with dirt. But beauty often hides where we least expect it. Within this tangled barrel waited a quiet kind of elegance, just waiting to be revealed. This is what it became, an elegant hollow form shaped by patience and care. If watching raw wild wood transform into something refined speaks to you, go ahead and subscribe. I've got more pieces like this still waiting for their moment. Now, let me show you how this root became art, one cut, one curve at a time. This project began with a dense, twisted chunk of Manzanita Burl, part of the root system pulled from the ground with dirt still packed in its folds. This piece measured about 10 inches wide and 6 inches tall, perfect to hold some presence on the lathe. I started by giving the barrel a full cleanup, brushing off loose bark, dirt, and debris that would ruin the bond. For stubborn pockets of bark, rock, and dirt, I worked in by hand with small chisels, picks, and hand wire brush until I hit clean wood. I trimmed the barrel round using a circle cutting jig on bandsaw, prepping it for casting. My casting mold is a 5-gallon bucket with a 10-inch base. To keep the piece from floating during the pour, I pinned it down with a piece of scrap wood and duct tape. Sometimes you don't need fancy jigs, just something that works. For the pour, I went with a rich sapphire blue epoxy and added a bit of blue to purple shift for depth. Once the mix was ready, I poured and moved the whole bucket into the pressure pot to cure, 72 hours under pressure to force out the bubbles. Getting the casting out of the bucket took some effort, but eventually it popped free. And the result looked clean. No heat cracks, no clouding, just solid resin locked around the wild barrel. I mounted the blank between centers and started shaping the block. My first goal was to round the piece and turn a temporary tenon on the top. I kept the speed low at first, about 500 RPM, and brought it up gradually as the form stabilized. Carbide tools are my go-to when epoxy is involved. Traditional steel edges just don't hold up long enough. With a temporary tenon in place, I flipped the blank and flattened the base to attach the final tenon. I used wood glue for the joint. I let it dry overnight. I also added a bit of hot glue around the seam for extra strength. With the piece now secured in the chuck, I began shaping the outer profile of the hollow form. I turned it down to a smooth cylinder, then eased it into the curves, letting the shape emerge slowly. Heavy cuts at first caused some minor chipping in the epoxy, but I refined the surface with lighter passes and frequent stops to check the form. Where needed, I used the scraper to clean up any chipped edges and bring out smoother transitions. There was a patch of epoxy in the middle that created a ghosting effect. I removed it with a few passes of the scraper. Once the outer shape was set, it was time to hollow. I drilled a starter hole using Forstner beads, starting with a 1¼ inches and ending with a 2½ inches, just enough to create clearance for the hollowing tools. Then I cleaned up the opening of the hollowing form and added a small decorative bead around the ring. This is my hollowing system. It's the Clark Deep Hollowing System. It's built around a rigid 1-inch bar and includes a laser that helps track wall thickness. For the actual hollowing, I cycled through 3 tools. A straight cutter for clearing the base, a shallow swan neck tool for the belly, and a deeper swan neck to reach the top section. I started with my shop-made steady rest to keep the form stable, but eventually removed it since it blocked my view of the laser beam. As the laser beam stretched and finally disappeared, I knew I was reaching my target wall thickness. Next came sanding, and a lot of it. I started on the inside, using a sanding disc and a drill for the deeper areas and hand sanding the upper rim. Throughout the process, I filled surface voids with CA glue. These steps often need repeating between grades, especially with something as rugged as Manzanita. Then I moved to the outside, working from 40 grit up to 180. I stopped there to leave enough tooth for the epoxy top coat finish to bond properly. Once the surface was smooth, I wiped it down with denatured alcohol to clean away any sanding dust and oils. The finishing process began with a clear layer of epoxy to seal and highlight the surface. I warmed up the top coat epoxy to help it flow more smoothly over the surface. I poured epoxy directly inside and let it drain and settle for 10 to 12 minutes to safe level. Then I mounted the piece on a rotisserie motor to finish the exterior. I left the hollow form turning on the rotisserie motor overnight. By morning, a few bubbles, dents, and bumps have formed that needed to be sanded smooth. For the finish, I used the two-step system from Clean Armor. First, I applied the Wood 750 tabletop sealer. This finishing system cures under UV light in just a few minutes. My final finish is 2 layers of Wood 757 top coat, curing each layer under UV light and sanding between coats with 220 grit. After the top coat cured under UV light, I sanded the hollow form from 220 up to 1500 grit. The end result was a silky, high gloss surface that highlighted every twist, swirl, and shadow in the grain. To finish it off, I used Yorkshire grit, original and microfine, to polish it to a glass-like sheen. I sanded and cleaned the base, then applied the same finish as the rest of the piece for consistency and protection. Finally, I buffed the whole piece with wax to add a soft luster and seal the surface. This hollow form pushed me at every step, hollowing the interior, working around voids, and finishing such a complex form. But pieces like this are why I love woodturning. If you enjoyed this build, hit the like button, subscribe, and drop a comment. Let me know what part of the process stood out to you, or what you'd like to see the next. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.